Welcome to our Development Geography Week, in particular taking a theme of transforming landscapes of well-being. Within this, we need to consider how the traditional measures of development have key terms relating to development geography, especially have been traditionally economically based. The most common measure of development is gross domestic product, or often you hear GDP. This totals dollar value, services, even including ambulance and hospital fees. So not much can be inferred from GDP numbers, except that some countries have economies that are larger than other economies of other countries. Then you also have GDP per capita. Per capita, of course, meaning per person. So dividing a country's GDP by the national population. And this provides a rough way to compare how wealthy and the poor average in a given country might be. But we can ask ourselves, what does development really encompass? Because development is about more than just money, it's about enhancing individual and societal quality of life. Along these lines, the United Nations developed the Human Development Index as a measure of how well people's basic needs are being met, including education, healthcare. Having economic means to provide them is no guarantee that basic needs will be met for all members of society, though. Also, prejudices may exist, such that some members of society have basic needs met, while others systematically not, as we see very commonly in the US. Here's a global map of Human Development Index, north of the Rio Grande, with very high, and Australia, Germany, Scandinavia, varying to much of Africa, Indian subcontinent, Southern Asia for that matter, being on the low end of the Human Development Index. It points out it's three separate statistics: life expectancy, education, and income, although there's broader factors factored into those statistics. So through the theme of region, we can look at a brief history here of development. Term emerged in post-World War II era when scholars as well as government and policy officials became concerned about the standard of living. In general, a low standard of living was most prevalent in countries whose economies were primarily based on subsistence agriculture. And importantly to know here, it was believed that introducing new technologies and skills would enable these countries to develop more productive forms of ag, and that industrialization would follow. So there's a certain normative or assumption type thinking being applied from the start here with development. Here it's translated into the notion of the three different worlds: first world, second world, and third world. Third world, sometimes we think of as being used negatively or pejoratively, but it's actually a term that those countries came up with as an alternative to the capitalist versus state socialist economies, communist nations of the time. From there, we can think of a different way of looking at the world that came about in the 1970s. And oftentimes you hear this term now, the global south. The map here has poor south written on it. And although poverty can certainly exist in a lot of those areas, the common term is the global south. You can see how Australia and New Zealand are excluded from that. Along these lines, we can look at different economic sectors that exist within these across the world and relate to development a lot: primary, secondary, tertiary. Perhaps the quaternary is less commonly heard. The intellectual and informational economic activities. So really spanning up, we can think of such as logging or mining in the primary sector, and then the manufacturing industries that would process those logs or mines into usable lumber or into vast array of different metals that we would use even for these computers. And then tertiary, the set of economic activities refers to different types of work necessary to move goods and resources around. So service activities, trucking being a very common one, house cleaning. mobility here for the second theme. We can look at transportation and development, especially starting in the Industrial Revolution. Saw a rapid transformation of the economy, introduction of machines, new power sources, novel chemical processes as well. This was exacerbated later on, greatly accelerated by steamships and then later railroads. So we can see through looking at post-colonial, pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial differences in transportation networks, how there's been a very significant change in how transportation affects development, especially with colonial era infrastructure being mostly concerned with getting people and goods to sea and river ports as expediently as possible. And today, the major regional differences existing in relative importance of various modes of transportation, highways, railroads, even especially planes nowadays too, and now we're even looking at space travel. So here you see a subway station in Singapore, their MRT system. This is fascinating, moves half of the population of the city-state. So Singapore is one giant city, and at the same time it's its own country, and millions of people moved around on a daily basis there. However, in the US, as an example of a wealthy country, aging transportation infrastructure is becoming a serious deterrent to the well-being of the citizens and even a drag on economic growth. It's estimated we need close to $4 trillion to be invested in the next 3 years at this point to update it. And the World Economic Forum ranked America's infrastructure at 23rd worldwide. This is an interesting stat to have for the uncle at the dinner table who might think that the US is the world's leader. Why is it so bad? We invest far smaller percentage of our budget compared to other nations, poor regional planning and political squabbling, also budget crises. The solutions that would privatize cost are very unpopular and often lead to more problems than originally had. You have an interesting graph of the percent of GDP invested on transportation infrastructure, the US, Europe, and China. Both of those regions dwarfing the US here. Through the theme of globalization, we can look at post-development, the rise of the global South. Even though they're considered underdeveloped, formerly were hubs of economic activity, technological innovation, and cultural diversity. In reality, very few of the world's places are impoverished, isolated, and predominantly agricultural anymore. Even with countries that may still be less developed as a whole, there's pockets of accelerated urbanization all around the world. By the same token, many developed countries and regions have slipped in their development prestige. Here you see the Songdo International Business City in Korea. And by comparison, we have Detroit's what they're calling third world cityscape, so the landscape of the city, abandoned house. Detroit's experiencing somewhat of a revival in the most recent years after decades of decline. Lots of opportunities for young folk to come in and buy cheap homes, such as this one perhaps, rip it down and build a new one. Urban agriculture is also very common in Detroit now, helping with that urban revitalization. So post-development, can bring this to the lens of globalization, a theoretical approach that's critical of these standard development policies that brought first world money and technologies down into the third world. Some scholars now believe that development constituted a more modern form of imperialism in that regard, controlling their economic, political, and even cultural systems. And they argue that this age of development is over. Likewise, we see the rise of the global South. South-South cooperation is a major dimension of this now. Also South-South cooperation via trade, technological innovation, other forms of exchange and assistance. We see this with collaboration between Brazil, India, China, even Russia to a degree there, and South Africa. It's commonly abbreviated as BRICS. But China's influence in Latin America is growing rapidly. It's a great example of South-South cooperation. Through the theme of nature culture, we can look at how climate change is greatly affecting development. The greenhouse effect here is a basic definition. We can think of the increased atmospheric carbon dioxide and other absorbing gases, especially nitrous oxide, carbon monoxide, which permits solar shortwave heat radiation to reach the Earth's surface, but then blocks it from going back to space. This causes a thermal imbalance and global warming. Sometimes the term global warming is avoided, but because not everywhere on the Earth is warming. However, global average temperatures are rising steadily, including ocean temperatures. Here we see the effects of global climate change mapped out around the world, especially in California and north into Washington. Decreased snowpack, rapidly declining glaciers. You also see increasing crop yields in southern Canada as the temperatures move north, how this will benefit agriculture there. You have droughts in many places of the world, South Africa, India, as well as receding glaciers in the Himalaya. Very, very significant effects that will continue to impact development and geography around the world. Raises the importance of alternative energy, including hydroelectric, solar, wind, geothermal. Here they even have nuclear, although that's hotly contested, and quote-unquote clean coal, coal with much fewer pollutants coming out of it. However, that's highly contested as well. The world still relies heavily on fossil fuels to power economic activities as the root of some of these problems, especially with personal consumption skyrocketing. So here you have Europe's renewable energy island, Samso in Denmark, model of alternative energy. Huge 100% of the 4,200 residents' electrical needs in this small area. The US could do much more with wind power, in fact powering the whole country's needs from just the wind coming off the Rocky Mountain front and just east of the Rocky Mountains. Carbon cap and trade. China's harmful air quality we can look at related to the carbon cap and trade because China's started initiating that. Human health has been severely affected and visibility greatly reduced, at least sometimes in these sandstorms. And financial experts attribute the recent slowdown in China's economic growth to the cost of pollution, resulting in disruption to business, protest, increased healthcare expenses. So here you see a picture of Beijing, the Tiananmen Square, Mao Zedong on the picture in the background, very famous spot in China, and the deteriorating air quality there. So through the theme of cultural landscape and development, we can really see that there's literally no place on Earth that hasn't been touched in some way by human activity, vis-a-vis water or air pollution at the least. Primary industries produce perhaps the most drastic impacts, such as mines, deforestation, and then among the most obvious features of the landscapes of secondary sector activities, such as manufacturing, are factory buildings. Often in urban, suburban areas, factory buildings can tell us a lot about a culture and economy. Service industries too produce a cultural landscape, such as high-rise bank buildings, for instance downtown San Francisco, fast food restaurants, very ubiquitous across the country, gasoline stations likewise, strip malls almost equally so. These are all part of the cultural landscape now. Here you see a mill building, which used to be very common in the 19th and 20th century, especially in New England, throughout the country really. However, these textile mills such as this one were abandoned over 70 years ago in many places. This is a very common sight where I grew up in upstate New York. It's a great insight into the cultural landscape, but none as ubiquitous as this these days. This sense of placelessness, a disorienting sense of sameness in the cultural landscape. Cars, roads, fast food, Starbucks begins to take a toll on the cultural sense of pride in an area, of attachment, of the opposite of placelessness. Placelessness would be topophilia, of loving a place. Any questions on this, we can continue.